Tonight, the collateral damage on both sides of the Atlantic, from the White House forced to consider its next move on Iraq to London, where the British Prime Minister is moving out. Crime and punishment. Tonight, the makers of a popular and controversial painkiller admit they lied about the risk of addiction. Worlds apart, but face to face today, an emotional exchange of views about the way war hits home. And one town's fight against childhood obesity and what their success could teach the rest of the country.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Today it was possible to feel the concussions from the war in Iraq on both sides of the Atlantic. In this country, President Bush, for the first time, said he is willing to give the Democrats some of what they want. And across the Atlantic in the United Kingdom today, the man who has supported George Bush more steadfastly than any other ally, Tony Blair, today announced he is through as British Prime Minister. Today was about the political cost of an unpopular war. As our own Tim Russert first reported here on this broadcast last night, the president now has real trouble in his own party. And with the damage now piling up, now the talk begins about a possible Plan B for Iraq. We have reports here tonight from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington and number 10 Downing Street in London. We'll begin with David Gregory at the White House tonight. David, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Facing the revolt that you described by Republicans today, for the first time, the president signaled compromise. After Pentagon briefings, the president conceded today that Iraqi leaders must show more political progress if Congress is going to keep funding the war.
One message I have heard from people from both parties is that the idea of benchmarks makes sense, and I agree.
Those benchmarks include political reconciliation between Sunnis and Shias and an agreement to share oil revenues.
Hello?
But the president insisted none of that can happen without security in Baghdad and pleaded for patience.
General Petraeus' plan ought to be given a chance to work, and we need to give the troops under his command the resources they need to prevail.
Even as the president was making concessions to Democrats, he remained on the defensive, threatening to veto a House bill that would provide only limited war funding through mid-July.
So we reject that idea. It won't work.
The search for common ground comes as the political pressure on the president has reached a new high. Republicans have said openly that September, when General Petraeus is scheduled to issue a progress report on the surge strategy, is a deadline for results. Privately, Republicans have been even more blunt. First reported by NBC News, a group of House Republicans confronted the president during a private meeting in the residence Tuesday afternoon, saying his credibility on Iraq has eroded. Tom Davis of Virginia was there.
We're all concerned about where this is going to go. And if the surge is unsuccessful, what's Plan B? Those were the concerns at this point.
Tonight, senior White House officials insist that Republicans have not abandoned the president, but these aides admit that the president has little left to do at this point but try to buy more time for his strategy to yield results. Brian?
All right, thanks, David. David Gregory at the White House starting us off now to the other piece of this story. There are combat casualties of the Iraq War. There are civilian casualties. Today we saw a political casualty, Tony Blair stepping down. Blair has been the Prime Minister of Great Britain for a decade, going back to President Clinton's time, and a staunch political ally of the U.S. NBC's Keith Miller reports tonight from London.
With his supporters near tears and wife Sherry looking on, Tony Blair delivered an emotional goodbye after 10 years as Prime Minister.
I think that's long enough for me, but more especially for the country.
Without mentioning Iraq, he asked for understanding.
Hand on heart, I did what I thought was right. I may have been wrong. That's your call.
Elected in a landslide in 1997, Blair was the rock star politician, the youngest prime minister of the 20th century. He was the face of cool Britannia. Then 9/11, and suddenly Blair made his decision.
Our job is to be there with you. You're not going to be alone.
The war on terror brought a conservative American president and a liberal British prime minister together. There was suspicion. Blair was a firm friend of former President Clinton. Still, Blair and President Bush found a way to bond.
I think they found it partly in this kind of moral approach to conflict, partly that they're both Christians.
Popular in the United States, Tony Blair was perhaps the best prime minister America never had. But at home, the press labeled him Bush's poodle, and his approval rating plunged.
He misled us into a wrong and foolish war, and that's what a lot of people, certainly myself, will remember as the main feature of his premiership.
In Parliament today, all eyes on Blair's likely successor, Gordon Brown. He doesn't have the burden of Iraq or the bond with President Bush. Tony Blair will step down on June 27th, but keep his parliamentary seat until 2009. And an aide tells us that he may just follow in the footsteps of his buddy Bill Clinton by setting up a foundation and traveling the world as an elder statesman. Brian?
Keith Miller outside number 10 Downing Street tonight. Keith, thanks. And now to this country.
President Bush is losing his best friend on the world stage. Tony Blair announced he is stepping down as British Prime Minister effective next month. The president called him a remarkable person, but Blair's role as the president's ally ended up costing him dearly. From London, here's Elizabeth Palmer.
Tony Blair chose his home district in northern England to announce that after more than 10 years, it was time to go.
In this job, in the world of today, I think that's long enough for me, but more especially for the country.
The local party faithful may still adore him, but the truth is, much of Britain has fallen out of love with its Prime Minister. Tony Blair swept to power on a wave of optimism.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
But his career was blighted, says Matthew Paris, by one key blunder.
Iraq, Iraq, Iraq. It must haunt him through his dreams now, and it will for the rest of his life.
Before the bad dreams, though, there was a honeymoon that began with the landslide victory Blair won by dragging Britain's old left-wing Labour Party to the political centre. Tony Blair, the idealist with a conscience, brokered a peace agreement in Northern Ireland and convinced Western leaders to stop Slobodan Milosevic's campaign of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. But when the world changed, Tony Blair's fierce idealism did not.
We will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk.
In spite of huge anti-war demonstrations at home, Blair volunteered British troops as America's main ally in Iraq. It earned him a standing ovation in Washington.
Mr. Prime Minister, can I buy you dinner?
Certainly.
But a new nickname at home, Bush's poodle. And it probably cost him his job. But today, Tony Blair tried one more time to justify himself.
Hand on heart, I did what I thought was right.
Tony Blair will formally step down on June 27th. His successor, Gordon Brown, a stern Scottish economist who already lives just next door to the Prime Minister here in Downing Street, will take over immediately. Brown has run Blair's prosperous British economy for the past 10 years. Although never good friends, they did make a good team. With the departure of Blair, Brown is left to lead a discontented country on his own. Elizabeth Palmer, CBS News, London.